Welcome to FREDLA's Learning Community for Family Leaders. My name is Jane Walker, and I am the Executive Director of FREDLA. We invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself today and let us know who you are and where you're from. Throughout the call, you are also welcome to make comments and ask questions in the chat box. If you're driving in your car or not at your computer today, these slides will be available to you along with the recording of the webinar, and at the end of our presentation, we'll let you know how to access them. This learning community is hosted by FREDLA, a partner in the TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, operated by and coordinated through the University of Maryland and funded through a contract with SAMHSA. The topic of our call today is responding differently to early psychosis, the role of family-run organizations. I am passionate about this issue and believe that family organizations have a critical role to play in supporting families caring for a child or young adult experiencing psychosis for the first time, and even before that, when the child or young adult may be feeling disconnected or suspicious. Here's why I feel so passionately. When I was the director of a family organization, we conducted focus groups with families whose children had experienced psychosis in their early teens. And I will never forget the mother who traveled an hour to participate in our focus group. The mother was in tears as she related that she had recently gotten a call from her child's school and was asked to come to a meeting about her 16-year-old son. When she got to the school, she was escorted into a room with about 8 people waiting for her, including the principal, vice principal, school psychologist, and various teachers. She was told that her son was acting strangely and hearing voices. She was also told that her son could not come back to school until he had received treatment and was no longer hearing voices. The mother had no idea what to do or where to go. She put her son in the back seat of her car and drove directly to the emergency department of a hospital about an hour from her home. Her son stayed in the hospital for a few days and was discharged on meds. That's all the information and help this mother received up to that point. It's now 4 years later, and I'm sure that that child and family have been through the emergency department many times. I only hope that she has been able to receive information and support from services that are like the ones we're about to hear about today. Before we begin our presentation, I wanted to take a quick poll and just see how many of us are working in any way around the issue of early psychosis. So if we can just quickly click on one of those buttons, either A, actively involved, B, aware, but not actively involved, or not aware at all. And let's see, we have quite a few people on the call, so we'll wait just a second while people take the poll. Looks like the majority of people are aware of early psychosis work, but not actively involved. And that's why we're doing this webinar today. We want to see those numbers change so that we're involved. So the services that we're going to be talking about today are through the Oregon Early Assessment and Support Alliance, or EASA. This is a remarkable program that is a model being replicated across the country. We are honored to have the director of the EASA program, Tamara G, with us today. Tamara is a pioneer in this work and is in high demand for presentations around the country, including presentations to Congress. So it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Tamara.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. I am really excited to be joining this group today. And, I wanted to start off by introducing a little bit about how I got into this work. And then, I'll talk a little bit about psychosis and, give kind of an overview of early psychosis intervention. And then think as well together about how this might fit into some of the existing efforts that you're already involved with. So, just backing up a little bit, as probably the majority of people on this call can attest to, I think many of us get into this work because of our own family experience, and the same is true for me, that in the late 70s, when my own family member developed schizophrenia, it was a very different world back then, and I learned a lot of things from what didn't happen and what needed to happen, and kind of the trauma that was involved in it for my own family. But also a big part of my own education was my mother's involvement. And at the time, she helped to start a schizophrenia support group and ultimately became involved in the creation of NAMI, both in the state of Colorado and then nationally. And so as a teenager, I witnessed her getting phone call after phone call after phone call from people throughout the community who were in desperate situations and being treated as kind of the villains in the situation quite often. I remember one family that called where it was Christmas Eve and their son was in the psychiatric unit and had swallowed a nail, and they were not allowing the parents to visit. And my mother had the phone number for the director of mental health for the state and called him on Christmas Eve and said, we've got this kid and his parents are not being allowed to visit, and they changed that situation. So I learned pretty early on that speaking out and telling our stories and advocating is really, really important for what happens next. And I've really made that kind of the center of my career from the time I was young, trying to change the way that people respond to schizophrenia in particular, but mental illness more generally as well. And for me, I experienced a major turning point in the 1990s when I started working for a system of care in Clark County, Washington. I was working for the mental health authority there, and I was assigned responsibility for the children's system of care, and I began to facilitate a cross-system group and became familiar with the system of care principles, and then we trained thousands of people and really started to walk the walk of what that meant. And at the time, I thought, oh my gosh, this is what my family needed all along. So my family started a team, and we engaged the mental health system kind of from our own angle. But to me, the system of care work was very much what families needed, and so I was very excited about that. And then in the early 2000s, the year 2000, I moved on to working for Mid-Valley Behavioral Care Network that was starting an early intervention program for psychosis. And so we worked with folks from the Early Psychosis Prevention and Intervention Center in Melbourne, Australia, and started the first the first public mental health rollout of early psychosis intervention in the United States. And it was, again, it was very exciting because the things that we were doing were the things that my family needed and that so many families I had met really needed from the beginning. But I always felt like there was something missing, that the system of care work that I had been doing before I came into the early psychosis work had a lot of opportunity in it, and it could really inform the early psychosis work. And I'm happy to say that we're just finalizing a paper for Gary Blau at SAMHSA on how these two efforts can come together. So the timing of this webinar, I think, is really fantastic, because I think that there is a huge opportunity for the two efforts to inform each other. So the work in Oregon went on to move from a regional effort to a statewide effort, and we began our statewide dissemination in 2008. I'm happy to say that we finally have funding on the table for every county in our state, and we finally are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm anticipating that within the next few months that we actually will have early psychosis intervention services available in every community in Oregon. So it's taken us a while, but I think we're finally about to arrive. So I'm sure probably most of you are very familiar with psychosis. Psychosis has a lot of different causes, and it tends to be defined more in terms of the symptoms that people observe, so hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that other people don't hear, delusions, developing really strange beliefs that are kind of outside of your normal way of thinking. For example, my relative, both of us learned Russian when we were young, and he sometimes will start to believe that I'm being controlled by a Ukrainian general, which makes no sense to me, but is something that he believes pretty strongly. There are a range of other symptoms that involve kind of linguistic processing, the ability to put one thought together with another, and result in some very interesting kinds of symptoms. And we have a whole long description of all the different symptoms of psychosis on our website that I'll tell you about later, but I won't go into all of them. With psychosis, there are also cognitive changes that happen, and I'll talk a little bit more about what some of those look like. And they actually are a lot more significant than what we've realized in the past. And then what we've referred to as negative symptoms. And I apologize again that this is probably really basic information for most of you, but it's important to have some idea of what we're referring to. So when we talk about negative symptoms, we're talking about things that are no longer present that normally would be. So, for example, avolition, losing the kind of motivation or the ability to move from one place to the other, or flat affect, so developing kind of a facial expression that doesn't respond in ways that people expect. And quite often that's mistaken for depression, but in fact it's not depression, it's really just almost more of a neurological change that's happening. So as I said, there are many causes, and this is something that's important to understand, because I get a lot of calls from people where they're experiencing anxiety disorder or personality disorders, or they've had they've started taking a medicine, or there's sleep disorder issues going on. And so one of the most important things that early psychosis programs do is to try to sort out what's actually going on, to make sure that there's a really thorough medical exam done, and also to kind of differentiate, that this is not just one condition. Psychosis can happen through a variety of different avenues. However, most of the early psychosis programs around the country specifically target schizophrenia. And so what that means is that people will be referred to the psychosis program, and they may be screened out even though they're experiencing psychosis because the psychosis is not consistent with schizophreniform psychosis. And what you'll find is that some programs are serving bipolar spectrum psychosis. So in Oregon, we include bipolar spectrum as well as schizophreniform. And then we also target what we call psychosis risk syndrome or clinical high risk. And this is an area where there's a lot of national debate going on right now. I think it's something that we have to be careful about, but also not kind of turn away from the opportunity that's there. So I'll talk a little bit more about kind of how psychosis how we think about psychosis. So one of the things that we know about psychosis is that first of all, we know that there are long delays happening before people access treatment. There's a study I'll talk about called RAISE, where they found that the median delay before accessing treatment was 74 weeks. And that's actually typical in the United States, that the delay before people get into any kind of care is often a year or longer, and sometimes you hear stories of people who have gone for many, many years before they've accessed care. And then once people get into treatment, we also know that the care that they're receiving is usually not based on the evidence that's available, and so it's actually not the most effective care. And so I equate it to a couple of different conditions that people are very familiar with, and I found that these two analogies have been very helpful in explaining what we're trying to do. The first analogy is to a person. If you thought about trying to set up a program that was designed for people in wheelchairs, and you said, we're going to put this program on the second floor of a building with no elevator, no ramp, and we're not going to do any outreach. That's kind of how we set up our mental health system for people with psychosis. So people will call and say, hey, we really need help, but because this is a condition that's affecting the brain, quite often people are not recognizing that it's an illness. And also, it often happens to teenagers and young adults who are already, not all that happy about doing what their parents suggest that they should do. And they're confused. They may think that other people are trying to hurt them, so they're having all these different kinds of symptoms. And so there are a lot of different things that can get in the way. And then when people call the mental health center, quite often they hear, I'm sorry you don't have Medicaid, we only take Medicaid. I'm sorry they're not motivated for treatment. They have to recognize that they need treatment and sign all the paperwork and come into the office. And so people just don't make it in. And in fact, there's some interesting research that's shown that one of the predictors of delay in accessing care is referral to the mental health system, which is really bizarre. It's hard to imagine how that could be. But I think the reason for that is that people call and they encounter a whole range of barriers that they don't make it through. And so as a result of that, we have people who are literally hanging out in their parents' basement, and they're being told by people in the mental health system that they have to become an imminent threat to themselves or others before they can access care. And that results in incredible tragedy that's entirely preventable. The other analogy that I like to use is the analogy of heart conditions. So if you thought about if our standard of care for heart disease was that you had to have 4 heart attacks and before you could access care, and then we would put you in handcuffs and we'd force you into care based on what we knew 20 years ago, again, that's our standard of care for psychosis in the country today, or that has been our standard of care up until about 2 years ago. So we're talking about changing the standard of care so that people have rapid access to services that are proactive, designed for their needs, and that are available regardless of insurance, which I know is not true in every community, but it is the vision that we're shooting for, and that's based on the current knowledge in the field. So, so that kind of gives you a sense of what early psychosis intervention is all about. Now, let's talk about the research a little bit. And one of the things that we've learned over time through a lot of research, through the North American Prodrome Longitudinal Study, which is a 12-university consortium in the United States and Canada that's been pooling their data for a number of years, and then also through a lot of the international research, we've learned that the onset for schizophrenia in particular, and psychosis in general, but especially schizophrenia, is often gradual. And so, as we think about it more and more as a developmental condition, we're starting to understand that some of the early signs are things that we might not ordinarily think about. And one of the most common changes is to cognition. So people begin to have difficulty with working memory, so learning becomes difficult. They start having trouble in school. They start having trouble with smell, which they're actually working on developing tests around that. Information processing speed becomes an issue. And there are other areas of cognition that are affected. And so the early stages of the illness often show up in school, where people are starting to have trouble where they didn't before. Also, during that gradual onset, they may start to hear voices, but they haven't yet developed any real beliefs around that. They're just kind of disturbed by it. Or they may start to have kind of strange beliefs or have perceptual distortions where, colors are starting to get extremely bright compared to what they were before, or, lines are starting to look wavy, or people's faces are looking distorted, or, they're just starting to have these weird beliefs. But they also, at the same time, are able to recognize that this is a change. This is not that there's something wrong, and so quite often they'll start making statements like, I think there's something wrong with my brain, I think I might be going crazy, etc. And they might say it to a best friend, they might say it to a parent, they might not say it more than once. But if we go in and we actually do an assessment at that point in time, we can identify what's going on with them, and we can engage them in support so that they can work their way through it. We also know that in that early stage, as people are beginning to develop the condition, they are at a higher risk of suicide. And then after psychosis has become acute to the point where they've passed that kind of clinical threshold, they're at particularly high risk of suicide. And then, the statistics around schizophrenia are fairly alarming. We know that the majority of people have gone on to be unemployed basically for life, and that people are dying a decade or more earlier. So there are many, many reasons why we want to be intervening early and really trying to change that long-term trajectory. Now, my feeling, having lived through this experience, both in my own family and having worked with many, many other families over the years, is that a lot of the outcome that we've experienced with schizophrenia has to do with the way we've responded to it versus the condition itself. And that's not to say that the condition is not very challenging and, that doesn't require a lot of support and persistence. But also, as you all are very familiar, we do have this tendency to pathologize people's situations and to create a limit on their capacity that's artificial and more based on how we think about it than the reality. So we know, again, there's been a lot of research that's shown that by intervening early in the course of the condition, that we can have a significant impact on the clinical outcomes, on the person's functioning, and on their quality of life. And more recent longitudinal research is starting to show that there seems to be a difference in terms of even identifying people within the first 2 months. So they're able to tell the difference 10 years later between people who were brought into early intervention services prior to 2 months and then after 2 months. So we know there's something about that 2-month cutoff. But you know, as a family member myself, you know, I sometimes am amazed that people can say, well, you know, somehow 2 months is okay or 1 month is okay, because you know, I've seen people literally die in their first week because they've lost their ability to tell what's real from what's not. And I also have both experienced myself and talked to many families who talk about in that early stage, you know, every day feels like a year. So, you know, to even suggest that a delay that extends into weeks or months is acceptable in some fashion, to me is just kind of reflecting a lack of understanding of what this condition is really like for people. So what we want to do is we want to get to people as quickly as possible before they've experienced significant consequences. And that's really what leads people down that road of that earlier intervention where we're, you know, maybe we don't know how it's going to evolve, but we're noticing that, gosh, they've dropped out of school or their grades have gone down, and they're no longer able to process information. So we don't maybe we don't know what's going on, and we have to try to figure that out. But we don't want to wait until they've already dropped out of school and they're involuntarily hospitalized, and now they're finally finding their way to us. Or as in Jane's story, you know, they've been kicked out of school. And of course, our ultimate goal is to keep both the individual and their family on their normal developmental path as much as possible. So, you know, some of these folks have had other situations. You know, there's certainly complex diagnostic scenarios and you know, just all the normal things that families deal with. So, you know, not every person has been on an entirely normal developmental path up until then, but many of them have been. So, you know, it's kind of a combination. You know, some of these are folks who may already have made it into a system of care, and some of them are people who have never had any exposure to the mental health system at all. So you guys will hear the term coordinated specialty care, if you haven't heard it already. This is a term that the National Institute of Mental Health has started to use to describe what the evidence-based treatment is for early psychosis. So it's kind of a label that they developed after the RAISE studies were complete. And there's a nice paper that we'll refer you to that describes kind of what the core elements are. I think it's important for us to understand that this is an evolving definition, and that there are ongoing discussions about what are the core elements of coordinated specialty care. And in particular, one of the elements that was not included in the original description was peer support, which when you talk to young people, they say is the most important thing from their perspective. So I think that we have to, you know, we have to recognize that what we consider to be evidence-based care is evolving, and that, you know, when we think about what's evidence-based, typically we're talking about things where there have been multiple randomized control trials to the point where there's, you know, absolute consensus that this is something that works. And so, you know, many of the elements of early psychosis intervention don't have that level of evidence associated with them, but they have a strong level of consensus associated with them. And so I say that because it's really important for family members in recognizing the things that you know are helpful to push for those things, and then also to push for the evidence to kind of come in behind, but not to create programs that don't respond well just because the level of evidence is not there yet. So all of these teams have certain things in common. One is that it's a team that crosses the age range, that kind of proverbial barrier of 18 and under or 18 and over. And so these teams are designed to serve teenagers and adults on the same team seamlessly without having to transition providers. So that's one of the first things. I already mentioned that that one of the most important things on these teams as well is that they are available to whoever needs it based on those symptoms beginning to happen. So in Oregon, we've made a commitment to ensure that the services are available whether the person has insurance or whether they have private insurance, which often doesn't cover the care. And we've had to create supplemental funding to allow that to happen. But we were clear from the beginning that it was necessary because otherwise people would just eventually find their way into the public system and be much more disabled by the time they arrive. So the second piece is community education and outreach, and that means these teams are proactively going out to the community, teaching people about what the early signs look like, making sure that people know about their service, and then when someone is referred, they're available to work with them both to try to understand what's going on and link them if that's what's needed, or to engage with them really proactively and really creatively. So we do a lot of training of our clinicians about how to engage with people. We're very, I've got lots of stories about situations where people have been, come up with alternative ways of meeting the person. We don't require people to have signed on for treatment before they meet us because we figure why would they sign on to treatment with someone they've never met before who they don't trust? So we are actively working to build trust with people to the point where they may decide that it's worth working with us. And then also we work very intensively with families from the beginning. So a family member, even if the person is 21 years old, if the mother calls, we'll work with the mother to engage with her child, and we'll involve the mother in strategizing around, what's the best way to be introduced, what is the child actually thinking and feeling, and what's motivating them, who do they trust, what part of our program is going to appeal to them the most, how do we maximize the chance that they will be willing to accept care from us. And then coaching the family as well, if there are safety issues, trying to make sure that the family and the young adult are safe as well. And then the team itself is based on more of an ACT model, so assertive community treatment where, it's a fairly intensive team-based model where you have therapists or counselors, and in Oregon we combine the therapy and the case management into a single function most of the time. Sometimes they're separated out, but the point is that we're in the community with folks and we're trying to both respond to their practical needs and interests, and then we're also bringing therapy into that. Now that's a little different within EASA than in some of the other models. So there's some discussions that are going on about how proactive are we, and what aspects of the service can happen in the office versus in the community. But we found generally that there's a lot of engagement work that has to happen before people can really participate in treatment. And so we put a lot of energy into that. Family education and support is absolutely central throughout the model. It includes engaging families from the very beginning, including families in the initial assessment, helping to coach and support families from the beginning, providing illness education, engaging families in decision-making at all levels. In our guidelines, we talk to our mental health centers about, including families on boards and quality improvement committees and hiring committees, as well as young adults. Supported employment and education is another key element, and typically that's following the individual placement and support model out of Dartmouth. Again, this is a model that was developed. It has a really strong evidence base behind it, although that evidence base was primarily with folks with longer-term illness, so it has to be adapted for young adults. And then the supported education model is also following IPS, but it doesn't have the same level of evidence associated with it. But we're very, very clear that both of these two elements are absolutely central, not only for early psychosis work, but for any work that we're doing with this age group. So if we're talking about teenagers and young adults, we absolutely have to be supporting school and work and kind of identity development around, taking on adult roles. Psychiatry and nursing are also critical within this team, and all of these services are provided as a team. The team meets every week to review every person, and they do a lot of cross-teaming about the decisions that are being made. So, as the psychiatrist is making decisions about medicine, they're also taking into consideration what's going on in school and how the family feels about the choices that are being made. So there's a strong kind of shared decision-making element to this as well. And then we try to stay focused on lower doses, paying attention to side effects. Again, in EASA, we include nursing as one of the core components. Not all of the CSC teams have nursing, but where they don't, it's really, really central to make sure that they're paying close attention to side effects, because that's one of the main reasons why people choose to leave treatment. Again, peer support, as I mentioned, is definitely absolutely central to people having a sense of the likelihood of them being able to make it through this process. People who have been through lived experience have a different framework and are able to articulate things in a way that other clinicians often can't. And then in Oregon, we also include occupational therapy as a core component. That's true in the peer program in Maine as well, and many, many of the international programs. We find that occupational therapists are very helpful in understanding the cognitive and sensory issues, as well as breaking down the functional steps involved in getting from one place to the other. So they bring a whole skill set that the other team members don't have. Now, I mentioned the RAISE study, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. RAISE stands for Recovery After an Initial Schizophrenia Episode. This is a national research study that was funded in 2010 by the National Institute of Mental Health. There were two separate studies that were funded. One is called Navigate, also known as RAISE Early Treatment Program. This was a national randomized control trial where they randomized some mental health centers to Navigate and others to kind of treatment as usual. They provided a very, very manualized approach, including something called individual resilience training, or IRT, that was based on a previous evidence-based practice called illness management and recovery, that's used in many adult mental health systems already, but it basically adapted it to early psychosis and to folks who were younger. So that's a very, again, a very manualized approach that integrates a combination of some cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing approaches, along with a lot of kind of illness education. There's also a family education piece to that, so it kind of fits in with the IRT training. And then there's supported employment education and an algorithm-driven prescribing process that's based on the Texas medication algorithm. So they had some promising findings from this. They found that that it did have effects on treatment retention, on employment, on quality of life, generally on symptoms. But one of the most interesting and important findings was that the treatment itself was effective based on how long the person had been ill before they entered into the treatment. So depending on how long they had gone, the impact was significantly different. And for the people who had been ill for longer, they actually didn't show that it had as much of an effect as for the folks who had been ill for a shorter period of time. So the second RAISE study was called OnTrack New York, or now called OnTrack USA. It's also known as RAISE Connections. And this was a study that was more focused on how do you implement early psychosis intervention versus the actual outcomes. There was an outcome element to it, but the primary focus of it was on designing supportive materials for new sites that wanted to get started. And it was supported by the state of New York and with some folks in Maryland as well. And basically, they implemented a similar process, but they didn't use IRT, and they based it off of a homeless outreach model that they had developed that had a lot of the same elements, and it had much more of an emphasis on shared decision-making. So both of those two studies have turned into a group of resources that are available to new programs that are getting started. And so, as new programs are starting, they're looking at, okay, there's OnTrack, there's Navigate, and then there are other programs around the country that also have provided support. So there's some really great work that's been done in California by the PrEP program coming out of University of San Francisco. University of North Carolina has the OASIS program that's done some really amazing work over the years. And then Yale has played a pretty big role with its STEP program. And Ohio has a program called the BEST Center that's taking the lead with the state of Illinois right now, as well as the state of Ohio. So all of these different technical assistance providers, including the peer program that I mentioned before from Maine, are part of a national training and technical assistance work group. So we talk to each other every month, and we try to look at what the differences are across our programs and try to learn from each other. So as I mentioned, there's still a lot of debate about clinical high risk and when and how to involve that, and I can talk more about that if that's something of interest to folks. So, again, as we think about the system of care model, most of these programs have a time limit to them. I think probably the only one that I'm aware of that does not is the OASIS program at the University of North Carolina. But most of the programs have about a 2-year time limit, which we actually know from the international research is not optimal. That having a 3 to 5 year time limit is probably much better. But for a variety of reasons, the majority of programs in the country have a time limit, and they're very much focused on transition into ongoing care. And so where there is not effective ongoing care, that's a huge problem for people and can put them at risk, both during the transition itself and then also longer term. They're at risk of losing the progress that they've made over time. Our program and most of the early psychosis programs around the country really emphasize participatory decision-making and person-centered planning as a major focus. And as we talk to folks in our program about what's working well and what they would change, basically the big theme throughout is do everything you can to identify and engage with people as early as possible, number one, and number two, really work on developing longer-term supports and try to make the program longer. So, we're definitely hearing that message loud and clear. So in terms of the family support organizations, I think that family organizations have a lot of knowledge about what this means in real life. Now, some of the programs have less knowledge about psychosis in particular, so it's important to make sure that you've got people at the table who have directly experienced psychosis. But, in one of the focus groups that we did a while ago, where we were asking what was the most helpful in the program, one of the themes that we heard was NAMI's family-to-family education class was the most helpful thing. So, the family support and education that people get can be really, really central, both in kind of having that sense of hope that, actually, there really is a way to get through this, receiving information, having somebody who will really talk with you and advocate for you, even though your child hasn't passed some kind of threshold where they've burned the house down yet. And I know I don't have to speak to you guys about the power of family-run organizations because we all witness that every day. So there are a lot of national resources, and there's a list I believe that Jane is sharing with the group. We have a national directory and a national organization called PEPNet that is being kind of hosted out of Stanford right now. All of you are encouraged to go and become a member. It's free. We have a national directory that we update every few months that is hosted on that site as well as ours. And so that group also has a bunch of different kind of work groups, and it's a place where all the different entities are coming together to collaborate and figure out how to move as fast as we can and as effectively as we can. NAMI also has a learning collaborative around engaging family organizations in helping states to move forward with this work, and I'm sure that they'd be very happy to collaborate. The National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors has a portal where they've collected a huge amount of information, and they've also funded the production of a bunch of webinars and a bunch of written materials. And then our website, easacommunity.org, has a section in there for families and young adults that talks through kind of what psychosis is, what the assessment process is like, what treatment looks like, what recovery is like. So we've tried to put a lot of resources on there. So, again, thinking about the role of family-run organizations, I think it's very, very similar to what you do in the other work that you're involved in. Providing mentoring, helping to encourage people to really speak up and be heard, helping them to learn how to frame their experience, or when you go in to talk to a clinician, how do you get what you need? giving people the opportunity to meet other people who are in recovery. And then also, it's particularly important to make sure that we've got support for siblings who are often concerned that this may happen to them, or going through their own trauma associated with this. And I don't have on my list here fathers, but we've also gotten feedback from dads that dad-to-dad mentoring may be really important, because sometimes they have their own kind of challenges around being able to accept a more gradual trajectory into adulthood than what might otherwise normally happen. Obviously there's all kinds of information that people don't have often, and folks who come into early psychosis programs very, very often, most of the time, are not on IEPs already in school, but they may qualify. So quite often they've never heard of a 504 or an IEP, and so you may be giving them the first information they ever received about it. They don't know usually anything about the mental health system, about crisis systems, about their rights. They're working through all kinds of insurance issues. And of course, we all know kind of what the challenge is for just working with young adults in general. I have a 20-year-old daughter myself who's about to turn 21, and she's certainly taught me that being a parent of a young adult requires a different way of approaching things, and there's a lot of developmental progression that happens during this time period that's just normal, but gets overlaid with all the experience of psychosis that can be so confusing and kind of set things back for people. And then, of course, advocacy. The majority of communities do not have early psychosis programs right now. And also, people who experience psychosis have huge issues with discrimination. So like Jane was saying, here's a school where they were about to kick the person out because they were hearing voices. So hearing voices, honestly, is not necessarily even a disabling thing, and it's certainly not a reason to be kicked out of school. And so, there is a lot of discrimination that happens, and, so the more that we band together to advocate, to create supports for people, both folks who are experiencing psychosis, but young adults in general who are experiencing mental health challenges, and just understanding that this is a really common and normal experience, and that we have to adapt our systems to really support people. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I've just thrown a whole lot of information at you, and there's a lot to cover, and I'm happy to talk further with people if you have additional questions, if you want to follow up after this this webinar. But we've got a little over a half an hour, and I know, Jane, you wanted to make a couple of announcements as well.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is incredible. I think our chat box has been absolutely quiet because everybody has been so mesmerized. I just wanted to make a couple of comments about just what you've said. I think everybody can resonate with the challenges that you described about the long delays before treatment, and about the challenges that the mental health system poses, the barriers even to getting care. And often a family-run organization may be the first stop along the way. And that's why we wanted to make sure that our family organizations were familiar with the kinds of approaches that are, as you said, standards of care right now, because so often in the past, as I indicated, kids would be kicked out of school. And this is our population. These are our children and families. And, it used to be that we didn't think of schizophrenia until the kids were in their 20s, but through this research that you described, the the early signs, the prodromal signs, are there much earlier, and intervening at that point in time can really change the direction for a family and child. So family organizations are steeped in systems of care, trauma-informed care, peer support, IEPs, juvenile justice, but this issue of psychosis has not been a topic that's been at the forefront for our organizations, and it needs to be. About 100,000 adolescents and young adults experience their first episode of psychosis every year. They're coming into our organizations. And SAMHSA now requires that states set aside 10% of their block grant to develop services such as the EASA program. So they're in every state, and Tamara mentioned, the National Directory, where you can locate the services in your state. And we also have a resource sheet that is available to download. Colin, is that available to everyone now? Along with the slides from this presentation. Make sure you know what services are available in your state. Tamara said they're not available in every community yet, but they should be in every state. And contact them to make sure they know who you are and that you can make that linkage. Because as I mentioned, early intervention is critical and can have such a major impact on the long-term outcome. So let's see what questions we have here. I think one, does anyone assess for ocular tracking difficulties?
Well, that's a really that's really an interesting question. There's definitely not, when you look at the assessment procedures that are out there in terms of what teams are trained to do, I don't believe that is part of the assessment process. I think that some of our OTs are probably actually doing that, and some of the psychiatrists are doing it, but it's not because there's a standard around that. So again, I think it's a good example of the type of thing where we may be missing some of the most important assessment and treatment opportunities that are available to this group. So as I was talking about the issues that people are having with cognition, most often we don't even assess for that, a little less provide treatment for it. So, a person may be having acute symptoms of psychosis, hallucinating, that sort of thing, and then they're not making it from point A to point C, even though they say that they want to, and we just see that as a motivational issue, or maybe something associated with the hallucinations that they're having. But in fact, there's actually something underlying it that's going on that we haven't assessed for. And so that's, for us, that's why we've brought the occupational therapists in, because we feel like there's a lot of underlying phenomena happening that culturally our professions have not necessarily been taught to assess for. So I will follow up on that question and see who's doing it, who's not, and I'd be very interested in an ongoing conversation about it.
Great. We have another excellent question about feedback for clients and families who are in treatment and have concerns about religious aspects and possession.
Yeah, so this comes up all the time. This is not a rare concern. Obviously, we're dealing with a variety of cultures, a variety of religious beliefs, and I'm sure this is comes up with a variety of forms of mental illness as well. There are people who don't believe in mental illness. We also know that culturally, in cultures where they have less of a medicalized view of it, that forcing a medicalized view on them may actually create harm. So the way that we approach it is to engage with the family and understand as best we can what their framework is, how they're thinking about it, and then we may introduce, we take what we call a collaborative empiricism kind of approach. So we introduce information about different ways of interpreting it, but don't require them to agree with us necessarily. And also our goal is to come to a shared understanding where it helps everybody to move forward. So, we have had people in our program who have gone through exorcisms, which is not generally something that we would either recommend or feel is in the person's interests necessarily. But, we've also experienced that sometimes strategies that families and communities bring to the table that are very deeply held beliefs have been successful. And so, I think that this is the kind of discussion that is just, that happens like every day on these early psychosis teams, because they are working with every culture in this nation right now. It's like we have people from, and we actually know that folks who come here from other countries are at higher risk of developing psychosis. So, we have people coming from a lot of different cultural frameworks, and so basically it's about engaging the family around the child's functioning and what they need, and not requiring them to adopt a particular belief, but kind of working together in a shared decision-making framework. And there's some tools and methods that we've used to do that, but the main thing is that we really look for the team members who are doing this work to have a real open mindset where they're able to kind of navigate different cultural perspectives and not negate those, but really kind of build on those as strengths, and also, kind of work together around that shared interest that we have in that young person doing well. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a broad answer, Yeah.
We have another question about what is the engagement process and who is engaging them when they come in the door. So who's on the front line when somebody would come in the door?
Yeah, so this may vary depending on what program you're talking to, and it's something where we actually are doing a lot of advocacy nationally around what we think that engagement process needs to look like, because some of the training that's out there kind of assumes that the person is already engaged, but in our experience that's pretty rare. That most of the time if somebody calls us and says, I think I'm experiencing psychosis and I need help, most of the time they don't actually have schizophrenic form of psychosis. They might be experiencing it, but so we know that engagement is really important. And the PEPNet group that I just mentioned actually just recently had 2 webinars, one that was done by a woman from STEP at Yale, and one that we did specifically on the subject of engagement. Also, there's a webinar on our website at easacommunity.org under the professional resources and the national section. There's a webinar there on engagement. So, and NAMI just came out with a whole kind of engagement policy document as well. So just to kind of summarize it in a nutshell, for us, the engagement process is entirely individualized. So whoever calls us, first of all, we try to get just enough information so we have a sense of whether we think they're likely to be appropriate for the program. So there is, there's a little bit of screening that has to go into that initial phase as well. But we start off with a basic philosophy that when somebody calls us, that we never use the words "there's nothing we can do" unless the person's an imminent threat or whatever. We never, ever, ever, ever use those words. And so even if we're going to screen someone out of the program, we're still going to try to engage with them enough to understand what's going on and enough to help connect them to the ongoing care that they need. So we actually put a lot of energy into our upfront consultation and support for people. And then assuming that it does seem like they're going to be appropriate for the program, and if we're not sure, we always err on the side that we assume that they are going to be appropriate. So what we'll do is from the first conversation, we're talking to the referent or the family member about who this person is. So we're starting off with a strengths assessment from the very, very first conversation. Looking at what are their interests, where are they engaged, who do they trust, what do they feel like they need, what are they concerned about, and then we develop an individual engagement plan for each person. And that's not necessarily like a piece of paper, but it's a strategy for each person. So for example, we had one fellow referred to us who actually had a really great support network, but he was completely cut off from everyone. He'd been kicked out of his job, and they had said that he had to be in mental health treatment before he could come back. So the only person he was really engaged with was a psychiatrist who he was required to go to by his employer. He'd been kicked out of his church. He was refusing to talk to his family. He was really angry at his family. And so we figured out that the only thing that it was really clear that he wanted, he was refusing any kind of medication, any kind of treatment, but the only thing he really was concerned about was paying off some bills that he couldn't pay. So we were introduced to him as a support to help with figuring out how to deal with his bill situation, and then that we could help him with other things too, but that would be kind of our initial focus. And so for each person, we try to figure out what their particular interest is, or their what's motivating them, and we try to engage around those issues or that that focus. So sometimes it's where are they going on the internet, and what music are they listening to, or maybe an interest in swimming. A lot of our psychiatrists have they'll have a guitar in the office, and they might play guitar together. Also, we'll go to the house. So we've had people who were literally holed up in their closet. And we've constructed whole plans around trying to get them down the stairs. So what kind of cookies do they like? And then to the degree that we have trouble figuring out how to engage with someone, we have a whole consultation process where we provide support. Where people can bring up scenarios and get, just get ideas and brainstorming. And the bottom line is that we just try to be really, really persistent. So, we've had people who it took us 6 months to a year to engage with, and we didn't give up.
Wow. May I ask a question about schools and how schools respond to children? I know I worked with a lot of school psychologists who did not feel they adequately were trained in this area, and they didn't know what to do. How can schools be better prepared? Is there a process going on to educate the schools in this area?
Yeah, every early psychosis team should be reaching out to the local schools, and they are a resource to the school. So if a person is identified and referred and they're having trouble in school, the members of the early psychosis team will actually go out to the school and work with the school professionals, both to provide additional training if they need that, or to come up with strategies, and sometimes even to do on-site services. So that there's a very explicit expectation for these early psychosis teams that they're all working really directly with the schools. There's some materials that have been developed for schools. There's one that we just put together with the state of Washington recently that's available nationally, called Core Competencies, What Every Teacher and School Professional Needs to Know About Psychosis in Young People. Again, we do a lot of outreach to schools. I think there's probably a lot more that we could be doing, but for sure, we're doing outreach, and we encourage, if a school is concerned and they're not sure what's going on, we encourage people not to do too much pre-screening and to just go ahead and give us a call. And if the school is concerned about, well, maybe I can't refer for whatever reason, but maybe the family can or will, so we try to be very again, just like with the individual where we're engaging with them, schools have different restrictions and concerns, and so we try to kind of work around those as well. But I think there's a lot that schools can do in terms of understanding how to support learning, how to support sensory environments, just understanding psychosis and how common it really is. And they often have misconceptions about who these kids are. They think these are kids who are going to be acting out, but most of the time they're the kids who are just not showing up to school. So there's a lot of basic education that schools need.
So you mentioned that not every community, of course, has these programs. What should happen if there isn't a program in the community in which you're working with family? Can you contact these programs at the state level or nationally to get connected, or what can family organizations do if they're working with a family and there's not such a program in their community?
Yeah. So first of all, I mentioned that NAMI's been putting a lot of energy into this, and they have within their helpline, they've been developing some kind of special protocols around how to respond. So that, and they've said that they're willing to share those protocols. So that might be an area where collaboration would be.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and then, I think in terms of, there are different levels of it. There's working with the individual family, and, there are a lot of resources out there for families in terms of kind of written materials and, I think the idea of connecting to what's going on at the state level is good because, there are new programs coming on every week practically, so there's a good chance that somebody in the community has already expressed interest in starting a program, and so sometimes those individual families become kind of the catalyst for that new program to get started. A lot of what these programs do is really about having a solid relationship with a skilled clinician and taking kind of a team approach. And so, there's nothing that says that just because you don't have an early psychosis program in your community that you can't support the young person in having a successful outcome. So, and we don't encourage families to move. I hear that a lot from families in other communities where they're talking about moving to another location in order to access a program. And I generally really strongly discourage that, because when you look at what allows people to be successful, it's really what's already working for them primarily, you know. And I actually think that, you know, if you have a wraparound process available, you know, with a child and family team kind of thing, you know, that sort of thing can be extremely helpful to these families. Now, the young person may have difficulty engaging with it, and you may need to get a clinician who's really skilled in psychosis and CBT and that sort of thing to, you know, also provide support as part of that team. But, you know, you can often kind of pull those pieces together that the young person needs to keep moving. And the really great news is that there are like 1,000 resources in this country right now to turn to. So, you know, both on the internet and then also in terms of kind of technical assistance resources and family support resources, there's a whole lot less isolation than there has been in the past. You know, every step of the way, you know, we've been dealing with systems that were not adequately set up to meet our needs as families. So, you know, this is not a new problem, right? You know, and in terms of, you know, thinking about, you know, how do we move our community forward? When I was working in those 5 counties originally, and, you know, we were going through major budget cuts in the state, and, you know, there was question about, you know, what kind of funding was going to be available for the program. You know, I used to just kind of remind myself that every single week in our 5 counties, at least one new person was going to develop psychosis, and the cost associated with psychosis, literally, you know, from day one, is so tremendous that in and of itself it provides a great argument for starting a new program, you know, because we're putting all kinds of money into things that actually really don't work at all.
Yeah. Well, what you've described is really an approach and, you know, rethinking exactly how one deals with psychosis. And so many of the components of the approach that you talked about, you know, support, education, wraparound, working as a team, all those things are so much embedded in our family organizations, whether they're associated with systems of care or NAMI or what. So this is exactly why this fits so well with the mission of our organizations, and something that really needs to be much more present on everyone's radar. So we have a couple more questions. One is, you mentioned side effects of medication. Do any of the programs follow a practice of using medication during the acute phase and tapering down or off in between acute phases?
Well, definitely tapering down from the acute phase would be a normal practice in most of our programs. You know, there's a general guideline that people, you know, try by identifying folks early, hopefully before the acute phase. We can start people on a lower dose and taper up versus having to taper down. But the reality is that you do still get a lot of people coming through the hospital or in an acute state, and so tapering down would definitely be the norm at that point. Now, in terms of tapering off of medicine, that is, there's probably some debate about that. Our guidelines basically say that after a person has had kind of an extended period of remission, that we will visit the possibility of tapering off of medicine, because we don't know what their long-term course is going to be, and so we really don't know what they're going to need. But at the time. And also for those folks who come in during the psychosis risk syndrome where, we don't even know if they're going to really develop a psychotic disorder at all, we actually don't even use medicine most of the time with those folks unless they have a much higher level of symptoms that are progressing rapidly and causing either severe distress or a real problem with functioning. So we don't automatically use medicine just because a person is experiencing symptoms. It really depends on the level of symptomology and their ability to manage it. And then in terms of tapering off of medicine, it's definitely something that we do with people in our program, partly because they make that choice anyway. So we kind of expect that a lot of young adults will choose to try going off medicine, and so we try to kind of help them think about why they're on the medicine and come up with a good plan for monitoring as they're going down. But I will say that this discussion about going off medicine is a controversial one, and it's not one where there's universal consensus in the field. And so there's still lots of folks out there who talk about trying to stay on the medicine for a really long period of time. And it's, the thing that we keep coming back to is this idea of shared decision making. I have a really great article that Pat Deegan wrote that we're just about to publish on her own experience of going off of medicine and ultimately deciding that she needed to stay on it, and then that leading into the work that she's been doing over the years on shared decision making. It's something people often choose to try, no matter what any professional might have to say about it. There's risk involved, and so, we have to be honest about that, because we don't want people to lose their lives. And at the same time, the medicine itself can be disabling, and so this is one of the most important discussions in this field.
One last question, and that is, we know that adolescents, young adults, are often involved in drugs, substance abuse. And can you just comment on that in relationship to psychosis, that can sometimes be a trigger, or whether sometimes the drugs may be used to treat, self-medicate kind of thing? What are your feelings on that?
Oh, yeah. So being in one of the states that's now legalized marijuana, this is a big discussion here. And obviously, drug use is very, very common. It's not an automatic screen out for just about any early psychosis program. So most early psychosis programs are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. I think there are situations where people have been using methamphetamine for a while, and that, there may be times where we might screen someone out because it looks like the drug use is the primary cause of the psychosis that they're experiencing. But it's probably more common that we do accept people. And sure, people use drugs for a variety of reasons, and sometimes they use partly in response to what's going on with their with symptoms that they might be having. There are debates about how common that is or not, but that's also one of the core elements of early psychosis treatment, is that the team itself provides motivational interviewing and substance abuse interventions as part of the team. So again, some of these questions that you're bringing up are just like core areas of discussion and program development within the early psychosis field. So,
Yeah.
we easily do, a 10-hour series
Wow.
just on the subject.
Wow. Well, this has just been a really incredible webinar, and I know that all 70-plus people on this call just have gained so much from the wisdom you've shared with us, the experience, wisdom, and passion I can hear. So our thanks to you for the work you're doing in the EASA program, setting the gold standard for psychosis intervention, and for spending time with us today to educate, inform, and inspire us. Thank you so much, Tamara. So to those of you on the call, you can download the resources. As Tamara said, there's many resources out there, so we've compiled one page full for you to get you started. A recording of this webinar will be available in about a week and a half. You can access that if you get the TA telegram, which comes out on Monday mornings. It'll be out a week from this Monday. Otherwise, Fredla will also be sending out the link to this webinar. A few reminders before we close. Our next learning community is Thursday, November 17th, 3 to 4:30 Eastern Time. We moved it up a week due to the Thanksgiving holidays. Our topic will be Building Bridges Initiative and how family-run organizations can get involved. And our presenter is Beth Caldwell, the director of Building Bridges. Building Bridges is an initiative focused on residential care for children. And family-run organizations, we are always working with families who have children who may be eligible for services from out-of-home program. I know my own daughter was in residential for many years, so this too is a topic near and dear to my heart. So this webinar will cover creative ways family-run organizations can partner with residential and community providers to support best practices in residential care. Don't miss our latest tip sheet on succession planning for executive directors. Some of us, of course myself excluded, may be getting older, and our organizations, however, need strong ongoing leadership. So this is a tip sheet that Fredla developed around that topic. And we will be participating in Giving Tuesday on November 29th, again this year. It's a really fun day in which people support Fredla online. So look for our emails, our posts on Facebook, and our tweets about how you can support Fredla. Lastly, before our next call, believe it or not, we will have elected a new president. I encourage everyone to go to the polls and make your voices heard for our children and families. And again, many, many thanks to Tamara and to all of you for being with us today. Friday is around the corner, so I wish you all a great weekend, and if you celebrate Halloween, I hope it's filled with lots of treats for you. Thanks, everybody, and special thanks to Tamara and Colin, who's been manning the webinar for us. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.